Colonel Frank Eldridge took out the first puzzle piece as bond clerk Marge Henning watched as a witness. One piece of the enormous jigsaw puzzle that had been put up on the wall of the Chicago Signal Depot was to be taken out for each war bond that was bought. A painting of the vessel bearing the city's name was concealed beneath the mosaic. Avenge the Chicago Day, which was held on March 3, 1943, in remembrance of the heavy cruiser that had been lost 2 months previously on Guadalcanal, included the celebrations. It was day 15 of a 40-day campaign to raise $40 million for the construction of a new warship that would bear the city's name. The growing Japanese Navy, her heroic crew and the man of war portrayed on the Signal Depot wall left a legacy of brave service that would last for a very long time. On April 10, 1930, she was launched at the Mare Island Navy Yard. The Chicago bore, hull number CA-29, is the fourth ship in the Northampton class. The ship, a typical American heavy cruiser from the interwar period, had a peacetime crew of roughly 750 and displaced 9,300 tons when launched. 4 single-mounted 5-inch guns and 9 8-inch guns and 3 turrets made up the primary armament as it was constructed. Later, a variety of 20mm and 40mm anti-aircraft cannons were deployed as backup weapons. The Chicago, located roughly 420 miles southeast of Midway Island, escorted the aircraft carrier USS Lexington on a mission to deliver planes to the island's airport on the morning of December 7, 1941. The task force launched an unsuccessful hunt for the Japanese attack force as soon as it learned of the Pearl Harbor attack. The Chicago participated in an anti-submarine mission close to Sydney, Australia, in May 1942, and engaged Japanese aircraft during the Battle of the Coral Sea. While covering the American invasion of Guadalcanal on August 7 to 8, 1942, the cruiser engaged in combat with Japanese aircraft once more. The Battle of Savo Island caused significant damage to the Chicago on August 9th. The cruiser was hit by a torpedo in the bow and had to return to the West Coast for long-term repairs. The Chicago left San Francisco in early January 1943 with the intention of returning to the South Pacific. The 5th month of grueling island warfare on Guadalcanal began in January 1943. It was not the end of the first significant American onslaught in the Pacific. The Japanese showed no signs of retreating, despite the fact that American forces controlled a large portion of the island. The Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Ernest King, was growing frustrated. He bemoaned, "I am still unhappy about the lack of progress." King wished to secure the Lower Solomons and carry on the offensive, but he said, "At present, as for some months past, it seems to me that we merely continue to swap punches with the enemy, to our advantage for sure, but without working to any plan that is evident here." Major Japanese fleet units were spotted at Ontong Java Atoll, which is located north of Guadalcanal, according to aerial surveillance reports in late January. According to some accounts, there was more activity in the northwest, close to Rabaul, a significant air-sea facility on the island of New Britain. A large-scale Japanese naval operation seemed to be planned. Provoking the Navy of Japan. Since October, Admiral William F has been in command of the South Pacific region. Halsey made the decision to take action. Halsey made the decision to use a wide range of sea power to cover a convoy of 4 troop transports en route to Guadalcanal that were packed with Marines and supplies. In an attempt to lure the Japanese into a significant battle, a total of 6 task forces were sent northeast of Australia. The carriers Saratoga and Enterprise, along with the new battleships North Carolina, Washington, and Indiana, would join the northward movement. In Task Forces 11 and 16, the carriers served as the lead ships, respectively. These battalions would be well behind the 2 forward task forces and would be prepared to engage any major units of the Japanese fleet that might move south. The overarching goal assigned to each task force commander was to eliminate any Japanese forces that were coming north. 2 task parties led the expedition, which departed on January 27th. Constructed around the transports of Presidents Adams, Hayes, Jackson, and Crescent City, the troop convoy departed New Caledonia. Task Force 18 was assigned as a close support group and included 2 escort carriers, 8 destroyers, 3 heavy cruisers, and 3 light cruisers. Rear Admiral Robert C. Giffen, who had recently returned from the Atlantic aboard his flagship, the cruiser Wichita, commanded the force, which set out from Efate in the New Hebrides. Graduated from the U.S. Giffen, a graduate of the Naval Academy, served in the Atlantic during the early stages of World War II, had commanded a destroyer during World War I, and most recently led Task Group 34.1 during the Allied invasion of North Africa. While the ships unloaded, Giffen was told to sweep northwest of the island and meet up with Destroyer Squadron 21, which had been in operation close to Guadalcanal. The rendezvous was scheduled on January 30th at 9 p.m. off the southwest coast of Guadalcanal. Giffen was alerted about potential Japanese intentions on January 29th. Several submarines believed to be in the region, and numerous enemy aircraft seen near Guadalcanal were specifically addressed. A potential night air attack was also forewarned about in the communications. At 3 p.m. on the 29th of January, Giffen withdrew the escort carriers Chenango and Suwannee along with 2 destroyers to accelerate his task group northward. During the day, the carriers continued to sail southeast, providing Task Force 18 with fighter cover. The remaining ships sailed north at 24 knots to maintain the scheduled meeting, after being released from the carrier's slower pace. The heavy cruisers Wichita, Chicago, and Louisville, the light cruisers Montreal, Cleveland, and Columbia, as well as 6 destroyers, now made up Task Force 18. Giffen was worried about potential submarine assaults, which was consistent with his experiences in the Atlantic. His cruisers were arranged in 2 columns, big cruisers on the right and light cruisers on the left. Before the 2 columns, the 6 destroyers made a half circle. Due to the less protected rear sectors, this configuration was not the best for protection against air attacks, but it did offer strong anti-submarine screening and fast movement into surface battle positions. Giffen gave his task force's ships no explicit instructions on how to react to an air attack. Airborne attacks. Task Force 18 was heading northwest toward the meeting spot at 24 knots while zigzagging on a 305-degree base course on the evening of January 29th. The fighter cover had gone to bed for the night as night fell. The force was roughly 35 miles from Guadalcanal and had passed north of Rennell Island. In the right column of heavy cruisers, the Chicago came in second to the Wichita. Louisville, her sister ship, was right behind it. Captain Ralph Davis, 52, was in command of the Chicago. All anti-aircraft weapons were manned, and the ship was darkened and conducting radar searches. The task group was now entering twilight as the sun had set. Unknown aircraft were detected by the Chicago's CXAM radar 25 miles to the west at 7:10 p.m. The planes were nearing the back of the task force in a broad circle. They were enemy planes, according to reports from the Wichita, on the TBS, communication between ships. Admiral Giffen, aboard his flagship, described the radar plot as a disturbed hornet's nest. The enemy aircraft had split into 2 groups by 7:20 p.m. and were moving toward the task force from behind the starboard beam. The ships were silhouetted against the evening glow by this placement. At 10,000 and 17,000 yard ranges, the groupings were close. His ship was directed to the general quarters by Captain Davis. The crew hurried to battle stations as the alert sounded. Mitsubishi G4. Type 97 bombers were the planes that were coming. The twin-engine land-based bomber, which the Allies referred to as a Betty, had an impressive range of about 3,700 miles. Cook Harold Beckman, who was stationed on the Chicago's well deck, witnessed the Japanese planes approaching for the attack. In an effort to remove the soldiers from their places, enemy Zero fighter planes began machine shooting the decks. Then we were attacked by the torpedo planes. Actually, it was a suicide assault. They had no way of turning back the way they came, and several of them perished in the fire on the port side of the Chicago. From the exposed starboard stern quarter, the swift Bettys began their low, rapid torpedo runs at the heavy cruiser column. The destroyer Waller, which was positioned directly to the starboard of the Chicago, began firing at the first wave of approaching planes at approximately 7:25 p.m. The Chicago's starboard 5-inch and 40mm batteries quickly participated in the firefight, with the former being fully controlled by radar. About 12 minutes had passed since the first radar encounter. The new covert proximity fused anti-aircraft shells were installed on the Chicago. The fuse, which was employed with fragmentation shells, had a radio transmitter inside that made the shell detonate when it got close to a target. When firing at hostile planes, the new armament made a near miss nearly as good as a hit. Aiming for the Chicago, from the after portion of the starboard beam, 2 bombers came for the Chicago. No wake was visible, although at least one torpedo struck the ocean 500 or 600 yards away. Both airplanes appeared to be unharmed by the intense anti-aircraft fire as they flew past the Chicago. The Louisville barely managed to escape being struck by a fast turn to port after another plane shot a torpedo in its direction. As all of the task force's ships opened fire on the attacking planes, tracer lights illuminated the fading sky. One Betty, exploding in the flames, struck the sea near the Chicago. The Japanese aircraft departed the task force's port bow after passing the cruisers. No ships reported damage at the end of the initial attack. Giffen stopped zigzagging to make up lost time and remained on the same base course at the same pace, intent on reaching the scheduled rendezvous. Flares suddenly started to emerge on the task force's sides. Red parachute lights flared on the water surface below, while white flares were observed hanging in the sky. Both kinds were dropped by Japanese scout aircraft to light up the ships in the now dark sky. Japanese planes could now find the American ships directly thanks to a beacon. More bombers emerged from the eastern sky shortly after 7:30 p.m. A torpedo was launched by one Betty before the Chicago. It moved across the wake of the cruiser without causing any harm. It was believed that at least one torpedo had passed close to the Wichita. The Louisville was struck by a second torpedo, but it did not explode. The air bombardment continued to concentrate on the right column of heavy cruisers, which stood tall against the flare background, with additional planes closing at around 7:38 p.m. Directly behind the destroyer, Waller, one bomber was destroyed by fire. Another was struck and ignited. Before plunging into the sea off the port bow, it blazed brightly as it sailed close to the Chicago, illuminating the deck with flaming fuel. The air defense officer for the Chicago was Lieutenant Edward Jarman. "We filled one torpedo plane so full of steel that it almost exploded on the Chicago," he said, recalling the near miss. "It was 10 feet away from our boat. Fueled by aviation gasoline, the wreckage burned brightly for 3 or 4 minutes, illuminating the ship and making it a prime target for other planes that were approaching. This helped us prepare for the second wave. According to Jarman, they all focused on the Chicago, apparently thinking she was a battleship." A pair of torpedo strikes. A torpedo struck the Chicago's after engine room on the starboard side around 7:40 p.m. with a loud explosion. John Irby, a radio technician, was in the vicinity of the torpedo strike. When the first torpedo hit, I was in the starboard corridor and only 30 feet away. We had to evacuate the corridor shortly after the torpedo struck due to a communications breakdown, he recalled. 2 minutes later, a torpedo wake was seen rapidly approaching. We joined a gang trying to put out fires, and we fought desperately to save the ship. Near the forward engine room and number 3 fire room, a second torpedo burst against the starboard side almost instantly. The first hit caused propeller shafts 1, 2, and 3 to stop instantly. When the rudder locked 10 degrees to the left and stopped responding to directions from the bridge, control of the ship was lost. The number 4 fire room and the after engine room were among the 4 compartments that were inundated. Slowly, water started to seep into the crew's mess. Now, listing to starboard, the Chicago started to calm down toward the stern. Radios, electrical fire pumps, submersible pumps, and lighting were all powered by emergency diesel generators. The forward engine room and the number 3 fire room were inundated by the second torpedo impact. They destroyed the machine shop. A number of small fires started. Gradually, the starboard list rose to 11 degrees. The Chicago dead was soon left in the water after the number 4 propeller shaft failed. Before positioning herself behind the Wichita, the Louisville made a fast turn to avoid colliding with her stopped sister ship. TBS informed Admiral Giffen that the Chicago had been incapacitated after being torpedoed. He moved to help defend the remaining ships from more air attacks now that it was dark. Giffen slowed the task force and altered the course to 120 degrees. The Japanese pilots had a hard time seeing the white wakes behind the ships because of the decreased speed. Fire from anti-aircraft was forbidden, unless it was aimed at a specific target. The remaining Japanese planes returned home after failing to gain a good fix on the American ships. To preserve Chicago. In a determined attempt to salvage the ship, damage control parties jumped right into action on the Chicago. In addition to having had extensive training, the crew had first-hand experience coping with torpedo damage during the Battle of Savo Island. Everyone was focused on saving the ship, just like at Savo. The first concerns were flooding and fires. Damage control parties promptly put out small flames in Radio Room 2 and the galley. To stop more floods, bulkheads were shored up. The ship's carpenter, Albert Bartholomew, led a damage control team that went deep inside the ship to seal off important hatches. He claimed that the party worked like dogs to keep us afloat. To dog down hatches, they swam 30 feet in water, chin deep, avoiding heavy tables and chairs as the ship rolled. The ice machine and washing facilities leaks were promptly sealed. After flood boundaries were set, bucket brigades could start working. Shortly after midnight, the jammed rudder was straightened out when engineers got to work on it. Getting the crippled Chicago out of the way of Japanese bombers on land was crucial to her survival. Thus, just after midnight, arrangements were made for the Chicago to be towed by the Louisville. The Louisville, commanded by Captain Charles Joy, maneuvered into position with its stern approximately 1,000 yards from the Chicago's bow. Sailors started the difficult work of joining the two ships with a thick steel chain after overcoming some initial issues that arose from attempting to position the cruisers close together in the dark. After being attached, the Louisville proceeded gently at 4 knots, headed for Espiritu Santo. Captain Joy subsequently remarked, "The passing of the tow was accomplished without a hitch and exactly as planned, with no injury to personnel or damage to material." The linked cruisers made their ponderous way south with 3 destroyers. In order to monitor any potential movements of Japanese ships, Task Force 18 surviving ships moved westward. Other sources of assistance were also en route. Task Force 16 was directed by Admiral Halsey to approach the downed cruiser. The task force, led by Rear Admiral Frederick Sherman, was located roughly 350 miles south of Chicago. The force, which was centered on the carrier Enterprise, moved north at 28 knots. During the day, Sherman was instructed to provide fighter air cover over Chicago. He had to place the Enterprise in a risky position in order to achieve this. The carrier needed to be close enough to the cruiser to provide his fighters a brief window of flying time, but far enough away that the Enterprise would be invisible to Japanese aircraft dispatched to attack the Chicago. If necessary, the escort carriers would offer additional fighter protection. The destroyer Sands and the fleet tug Navajo were also sent to help with the rescue effort. On board the Chicago, frenzied work went on. Because of the twisted metal from the torpedo hits, the number, 2 mess hall, forward engine room, after engine room, and machine shop were exposed to the sea. However, significant work was being made to remove water from flooded regions, and the majority of leaks in other compartments had been sealed off. Now, the starboard list needed to be corrected. Boiler number 4 was restarted just after midnight in order to give the ship more power. By moving the fuel oil, booster pumps might now update the list. The skipper gave the order to cut loose and place most of the floater nets and life rafts on the deck as a precaution. The Chicago News prognosis appeared to be getting better. We were quickly settling, and it appeared uncertain if we would sink or not. Lieutenant Jarman remembered, "We kept her up, but the following morning, we were taking on more water than the books said we could and keep afloat. Perhaps the cruiser would survive to fight another day." The Japanese noticed. On January 30th, just before 6 in the morning, 4 Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers departed the Enterprise's flight deck. Their task was to visually identify the Chicago by vanishing into the pre-dawn sky. The damaged ship was spotted around 35 miles east of Rennell Island at 7:15 a.m. Fighter Squadron 10's 6 Grumman F-4F Wildcat fighters were on post overhead by 8 a.m. Above the Enterprise, 4 more fighters circled. Shortly after 8 in the morning, the tug Navajo arrived to relieve the Louisville of its towing responsibilities. Admiral Giffen gave the Chicago the signal in the early afternoon to send a destroyer alongside so that Captain Davis could remove any extra crew. Inquiring if the destroyer could also transport his injured soldiers to a land hospital, Davis gestured the Wichita back. Giffen retorted that, because of the ongoing submarine danger, no destroyer could depart the task group. Given the likelihood of another air attack, Davis made the decision to keep the crew on board and ready to defend the ship. Halsey later that day ordered Task Force 18's remaining intact cruisers to return to port. Admiral Giffen wished the Chicago luck at 3 p.m. and then sailed south toward E-Fate. The task force's fighter direction officer aboard the Wichita departed with the cruisers. The fighters tasked with defending the Chicago would therefore lack on-site command and control. Under the Navajo's tow, the cruiser proceeded southward at 4 knots while being screened by 6 destroyers. The Chicago progressively crawled farther away from the threat of Japanese aircraft with every hour that went by. The Japanese appeared intent on preventing the disabled cruiser from escaping. About 20 miles west of the carrier, a Japanese spotter plane was spotted, and at around 8:30 a.m., Wildcat fighters over the Enterprise tracked it down. Both the carrier and the disabled cruiser's positions were probably reported by the aircraft. American aircraft not in position, not in Nwanda. Coast watchers saw a Japanese plane flying south of New Georgia toward Rennell Island by mid-afternoon. Soon after, the Enterprise received a warning communication from Guadalcanal. The carrier's fighter direction staff rapidly calculated that the bombers would arrive around 4 p.m. At this point, the Enterprise was roughly 43 miles southeast of Chicago. Above the cruiser, 10 Wildcat fighters, under the command of Lieutenant Commander William Kane, were patrolling. Fighters over the Chicago saw a lone Japanese aircraft arriving at high altitude north of Rennell Island at 3:40 p.m. The aircraft was probably a spotter, deployed ahead of the main attack formation to direct it to the target. Kane sent forth 4 Wildcats to pursue. The Japanese aircraft swung to the south and circled Rennell Island's eastern tip, where it could see the Chicago and the Enterprise. The Wildcats pursued, racing approaching the twin-engine Betty at full speed. The Japanese jet started to slow and trail smoke when its starboard engine was knocked out by a well-placed burst of machine gun fire. For the kill, Ensign Hank Lidar drew his Wildcat close. The enemy plane quickly caught fire, exploded into a ball of flames, and began to spin out to sea. The 4 fighters were approximately 40 miles from the Chicago and out of position to deal with the main enemy formation that was now coming because of the pursuit. An oncoming aircraft of 12 Japanese bombers, 67 miles away and bearing 300 degrees, was detected by the Enterprise's radar at 3:54 p.m. According to the course, the bombers were going straight for the Enterprise. As the surrounding ships closed to provide a shield of protection, the carrier accelerated. As the radar map revealed the enemy planes approaching at 8,000 feet with their noses low, preparing for torpedo runs, anti-aircraft guns were pointed skyward. 10 more warriors were ready to launch to confront the assailants. Lieutenant McGregor Kilpatrick was now in charge of the 6 fighters lingering over the Chicago after Kane had landed to refuel. Kilpatrick's 6 fighters were steered away from the Chicago into a position to intercept the bombers en route to the carrier by the Enterprise's fighter direction team. As the Wildcats positioned themselves to confront the approaching assault, Kilpatrick and his wingman broke away from the other 4 fighters. The Japanese bombers abruptly turned sharply away from the Enterprise and headed straight for the Chicago, even though they were only 17 miles from the carrier at the time. We descended to the assault. In a subsequent interview, Kilpatrick recounted, "The Japanese commander saw our Wildcat fighter planes and realized he could not get across the miles separating him from the task force, so he took what seemed to be the easy way out. With a sharp turn, the torpedo planes headed west toward the Chicago." Kilpatrick's 4 Wildcats, which had just moments before been poised to stop the approaching bombers before they could reach the Enterprise, were now pursuing the enemy aircraft. Aircraft from the escort carriers that had split from Task Force 18 the day before, as well as the 10 aircraft that had launched off the carrier, were too far away to contribute to the next air conflict. The only people in a position to stop the bombs before they reached the Chicago were Kilpatrick and Bob Porter, his wingman. On the first pass, both Wildcats wheeled abruptly and charged in, saturating two Bettys with machine gun fire. Before the Japs had come completely around, two of their number were spinning down, with dead pilots at the controls. Kilpatrick described the event. The remaining torpedo bombers reinforced the attack. 4 more hits from the torpedo. Following that, there was a brief but intense fight that happened quickly and near the damaged ship. A lookout on the Chicago saw the approaching bombers from 7 miles away as the CXAM radar was not operational due to damage sustained in the initial torpedo attack. We counted 11 aircraft coming in quickly and low from the starboard side. Standing directly between the Chicago and the incoming aircraft was the destroyer La Valette, which fired all of its guns aloft. The Chicago's starboard 5-inch battery joined in at an initial range of 8,000 yards 2 minutes after the initial contact, firing the first of the battle's 49 rounds of ammunition. As range permitted, the smaller 40mm and 20mm guns began to fire. Before the enemy planes could fire their lethal torpedoes, the crews of both ships engaged in a valiant battle to shoot them down. On board the Chicago, Marine Sergeant Anthony Anderson described how his troops continued to battle despite being severely wounded and in grave danger. Despite having 2 bullets in his back, Private William Stander kept shooting until I removed him from his harness, got inside, and continued to fire. Until his breakdown, Private Harold Dixon remained at his post. Private Verona. Brown sustained a bullet wound to his thigh, but survived and was subsequently taken off the ship on a stretcher. Brown suffered a shrapnel wound in his right leg, but he dropped down on one knee and continued loading. Off the starboard side of the Chicago, at least 2 Japanese aircraft plummeted into the ocean. As though to collide with the cruiser, a third Betty came up. Anti-aircraft gunners attempted to shoot the plane down as it raced toward the cruiser, one engine burning. The burning aircraft struck the ocean off the port quarter, missing the ship's stern. The 4 fighters had already shifted their focus from the Enterprise caught to the Japanese bombers by this point. Following the Japanese bombers into the area of anti-aircraft fire being put up by the Chicago and the La Valette, they joined Kilpatrick and Porter. As the Wildcats followed the bombers directly over the Chicago, they sent 2 more Japanese planes down in flames, but amazingly, none of them were damaged. With the Wildcat fighters in close pursuit, the last enemy aircraft passed and the anti-aircraft fire dwindled. 5 torpedo wakes were seen approaching the Chicago from the starboard beam shortly after the bombers had passed. The cruiser was unable to take any evasive action because the tow was only moving at 3 knots. At 4:24 p.m., the forecastle and bridge were saturated with water and debris as the first torpedo struck well forward. 3 additional torpedoes burst in quick succession a few seconds later, several of them close to the engine and engineering rooms that had already sustained damage. The stern received the 6th torpedo. 1 torpedo struck the port side of the La Valette, which was positioned between the Chicago and the assaulting bombers. The explosion claimed the lives of 22 crew members, including Lieutenant Eli Roth, an engineering and damage control officer. Almost immediately after the explosion, the forward boiler and engine rooms were inundated, and the water quickly moved to the after boiler room. The flooding was contained thanks to the damage control party's prompt intervention. After enduring the ordeal, the La Valette was eventually pulled to port. Chicago wouldn't have the same luck. At last, the Chicago sinks. It quickly became clear that the Chicago was having major problems. The list to starboard rapidly worsened as water flowed in after the torpedoes struck. Captain Davis ordered the ship to abandon, since the situation was bleak. Due to the growing list, life rafts were thrown overboard with some difficulty on the port side. The Navajo's crew worked to cut the tow line. There was another battle going on below as the crew started to disembark. Many of the crew members who had been injured in the initial attack were now stuck in the flooding compartment in the sickbay. Lieutenant Jarman remarked on the gallantry of Lieutenant Everett Jones, the ship's physician. Doctor. After treating a patient with spinal meningitis, Jones attempted to save another patient, but was unable to descend again due to the rushing water. Jarman remembered a smooth evacuation. We used rafts to remove all of the survivors. All of our almost 300 recruits were disciplined and awaited orders. The Chicago rocked to starboard and started to sink stern first with colors flying, but there was no panic. She went down quickly but smoothly after laying over on her starboard side, Jarman said. She gave herself a 5-inch salute as she descended, shells exploding from the torpedo's heat set, sick fires. Irby floated in the ocean and watched the ship sink. It was similar to witnessing a loved one perish beneath the waves. The bow vanished beneath the sea at 4:43 p.m., 19 minutes after the first torpedo struck, amid the cheers of all the soldiers afloat in the water. The once proud cruiser Chicago was now a thing of the past. The crew of the Chicago was rescued by the Navajoan with the help of the destroyers Waller, Edwards, and Sands. Until it was thought that every survivor had been found, ships and airplanes kept searching the region. 1,069 of the 1,130 officers and men who were on board the ship when the attacks occurred were saved. The crew's excellent and fearless work in keeping the ship afloat after the first action, and for their courageous and orderly conduct in abandoning ship when the ship was sinking, were commended by Captain Davis in his official action report. Chicago's defeat and Guadalcanal's victory. The Rennell Island battle was over. The Japanese, for their part, declared a resounding triumph. In 2 days of airstrikes south of Guadalcanal, Japanese naval air forces sank 3 battleships and 2 cruisers, according to a report by Radio Tokyo on February 1st. The only factual information in the communiqué that appeared to be directly included in the report was the attack on the Chicago. Intensive torpedo strikes were also launched against a ship that had managed to avoid damage the night before. She was hit multiple times before sinking with a huge explosion, according to the propaganda claim. In the same period, the U.S. Navy claimed to have shot down 17 Japanese torpedo planes. The 4 American transports arrived and left Guadalcanal without incident, as the Japanese were concentrating on attacking and sinking the Chicago. The Japanese fleet was getting ready to cover the withdrawal of Imperial soldiers from Guadalcanal, as was later discovered. On the evening of February 1st, Japanese warships started evacuating the island, a procedure that lasted for the following 7 days. American ground forces finished their advance to the island's western tip early on February 9th. The protracted and brutal battle for Guadalcanal came to an end when their commander radioed, "Total and complete defeat of Japanese forces affected 16:25 today." There were several significant circumstances to the Chicago's demise. The most important of these is Admiral Giffen's total concentration on meeting the ships near Guadalcanal at the scheduled moment, regardless of other factors. He organized Task Force 18 in a formation unsuitable for air defense because he was unfamiliar with the realities of battle in the Pacific. The crippled Chicago was under the fighter cover of aircraft carriers when Japanese bombers launched an attack on her due to a number of issues, stupid decisions, and simply terrible luck. The sinking of the Chicago was seen by the Japanese as a support for their new night torpedo strike strategy. On August 20th, 1944, the new Chicago, another heavy cruiser, was launched. The gathering that had gathered at the Philadelphia Navy Yard along the Delaware River for the occasion was welcomed by sunny skies and a refreshing wind. 2 additional naval warships, the heavy cruiser Los Angeles and the carrier Antietam, were also launched on the same day. The mayor of Chicago's wife, Mrs. E.J. Kelly, shattered the traditional bottle of champagne against the new cruiser's hull in accordance with customs. "I christen thee Chicago in the name of the United States." The ships we launched today have a dual mission, Undersecretary of the Navy Ralph A. Bard informed the audience during the day's keynote presentation. Speaking specifically about the new Chicago, he said to the audience, "But it was the second Chicago that captures our imagination. Although it may seem far away now, the final fight of the previous Chicago would not be forgotten anytime soon." The author of this post, John Domagowski, lives in the Chicago region and has spent many hours conducting thorough research.